Hello and welcome to the War Report. Now, do we have a hell of an episode for you tonight? Just mainly Venezuela stuff. We have some other smaller stories we want to cover first, but the majority of the show will be focusing on the chaos in Caracas. I see I plugged the title there, which means I'm good at this. 40 episodes it took me 40 episodes, but I finally got it down. But without further ado, we're just going to jump right into this, what can only be described as an absolute shit show. So, first I want to start out with some smaller stories. Now, the first one I noticed from this week was the NATO resolution. Now, the episode I did last week, unfortunately, you could not join us because you have to do your work for the KGB or whatever it is.
Yeah, Vlad called, and
but
I'm back now. The
yeah.
jet lag is gone, and I'm in perfect shape.
But after Trump's comments last week about NATO and pretty much disparaging them and trashing them up and down, which was great, I covered that extensively last week, the House of Representatives voted in a 357-22 resolution to bar Trump from withdrawing from NATO, which means there were about 40 members of Congress who sat this out, which I find kind of interesting. The other thing I also find interesting is when it comes to getting approval for things like that, the House of Representatives is irrelevant. It's to the Senate to ratify treaties and bar the president from leaving certain treaties, which, again, that's also a gray area. So the House doing this is a giant virtue signal by the Democrats who need to keep up with this Russian narrative and the neocon Republicans.
Yeah, I would agree. And, Spectre had a poll that came out this week, and support for withdrawal from Syria by Republicans is at 70%. Support for staying in Syria by Republicans is less than 18.
Yeah, and then amongst independents, it was 58-27.
Yeah, something like that. That may have been.
I mean, there were still good numbers.
The Democrats are for staying in both places, essentially.
Yeah, that's what I saw. I saw that you retweeted that, and you had a bit of commentary to add on to that. But yeah, I just thought it was interesting how the tides are turning, how Trump has the gall not even to say. I mean, he pretty much said empty-handedly, we could leave NATO tomorrow, wouldn't make a difference. Not actually threatening to leave NATO, but continuing his campaign of basically harassing them, which, again, I support fully. I just think it's funny to see the House come out and people grill these congressmen who voted against it. There was a list of all 22 and saying, you need to write them, you need to call them, tell them how disappointed you are with them. And a lot of them were from rural districts. Actually, he's not my congressman, but he's from a district nearby. I'm not going to say who he is. I don't want to give out too much information. But yeah, he's from a rural, cornfield farming district. I doubt the people here care too much about U.S. standing in Europe.
Yeah. I mean, it's a tricky situation, right? I mean, we've talked about American policy internally and externally, and how at this particular juncture, it's schizophrenic. I don't think America is going to get out of NATO anytime soon.
Oh, no, NATO will fall apart before we actually get out of it.
Right, but when it does, I mean, I think that will mark that America will be a very, very different country.
Yeah, because, for better and for worse, and there's a lot of worse.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just saying that, from the Marshall Plan onwards, it was always understood that America would be the biggest contributor to NATO because, of course, that was a safeguard from any other country that at that time that could have had a revolution. This is in the days of Gladio 1, and that's just something that they couldn't risk. And it's remained that way ever since. So I think that the debate in NATO too is not just should NATO exist, but how should NATO exist after the Cold War?
Yeah, and I actually saw some interesting pieces. I didn't get too much into them. I actually have them bookmarked along with a million other things. But NATO's main purpose, if they're existing at this point, is trying to justify its own existence. And it's become a bit paradoxical, honestly.
Yeah, I agree.
Now, I told you about this one off air, but I know the audience will appreciate this, and I thought it was quite funny myself. Now, Israel has said they will now live tweet future strikes on Syria. So the IDF account has announced that they'll be officially tweeting every time they strike Syria. Now, perhaps taking a page out of Trump's book, apparently social media is the future of politics if you listen to any, analyst worth their 2 cents. Now, if you ask me, this really kills the element of surprise, which is something you want for if you're going to launch a surgical strike on your enemy. Maybe that's just me. Now, this move, to me, maybe you disagree, also reeks of desperation, begging the world to notice any action that they take. And my last question is, will they also report the 37 of 40 missiles that do not make it to their targets?
I didn't know what the letter in Hebrew for the letter L in Hebrew looks like, or F, or any of the other letters. I'm sure they're going to say "own." Assad is owned.
Yeah.
They're going to do shit posting and bombing at the same time. The truth is, the Syrians are getting better at blocking the missiles. Israel, yes, did kill several officers. That's true, but the effort it was a lot more than it's ever been before. So, I mean, I think I agree with you. This is very desperate. It's like, Warren um, or Camilla Harris level of look. I'm just like you guys, right? So it's a way of looking trendy and relevant, but waging illegal war at the same time. So
Yeah, but it struck me as more funny than anything. It's like, and especially considering the fact Netanyahu has an election in about 2.5 months. There's also that. It's like, look at how cool I am. My cabinet, my military. We know how to use social media like the cool kids. But
yeah,
again, it seems like anyone who tries to imitate Trump, whether domestically or foreignly, it seems to be a consistent rule that they will almost always fail. Now,
yeah. Good point.
yeah. But just another small story I want to cover before we really get on is in Europe, the European Union, Salvini, despite his comments on Venezuela, has still been going very hard at the European Union, which I say more or less makes up for, but we'll get into his comments in a second. So Salvini and Macron have continued their months-long feud, as well as Salvini calling Merkel a weak leader. Now, he derided Macron for his low approval and urged the French to support Eurosceptic candidates for the upcoming European Parliament elections. Now, this came after Italy's deputy prime minister, Luigi Di Maio, came out and supported Yellow Vests and accused France of neo-colonial policies in Africa.
That's the way to own, yeah. Salvini is playing an interesting game. I know Soldo had a good tweet that I agreed with, that he felt that this was Salvini's first misstep, and it's possible. My heart says yes. However, Italy as a country is not really able to negotiate power, and so my guess is he's sticking with the narrative for Venezuela, but he's keeping the attack on Macron. And the reason for that is to both remain in the camp and be able to critique the camp, so to speak.
Yeah, I mean, what you have for Salvini, just as an aside, for those of you who don't know, Salvini supported the Venezuela protests, but you have to look at it. Italy, ever since, especially the new government, but even before, has walked the tightrope where we're going to side with the Russians, we're going to side with the U.S., we kind of want to maintain a balance between the two. Now, more so under this administration, under this government, they have been very close to the Russians in terms of trying to lift sanctions, using their influence in the European Parliament, and also actually making trade deals with the Russians. So that's been a new course for Italy. And I imagine there were probably some State Department officials, CIA officials, somebody from the U.S. coming in saying, look, we don't like how close you are with the Russians. It's, a little bit too close for comfort for us. Now, look, you can go around by saying you support the Venezuelan revolutions. I mean, after all, Venezuela is somewhat in the Russian camp, more so the Chinese, but that's aside the point. That's my own Constantine's commentary to make a slight joke there, but I digress. But yeah, somebody probably gave Salvini, not only Salvini, but probably Trump, a talking to about this is what you're going to say and this is how it's going to go down. You don't like it, you can deal with us. So take your pick. So yeah, I imagine Salvini's probably walking that tightrope, and it was probably more expedient for him to take the U.S. side on this one.
Right. I mean, you could also look at it this way: that make no mistake, if America really goes full hog into Venezuela, Trump will blow his chances to win in 2020. I'm just going to say that now.
Oh, absolutely. I agree with you. I have more to back that up as we get later in the show.
Yeah,
hold on
to that. It's over for him if he does it. However, I think, for Salvini, it's across the ocean. It's an easy thing to signal, along with the Western camp. But that also buys him maneuverability and power within to be able to critique Macron and Merkel.
Yeah, and it was also one statement, and this kind of ties back to what not only him but De Maio, as I mentioned earlier, was saying. They also criticized France for not doing it to stabilize Libya after destabilizing it in the first place. So, Salvini has himself in this position where he made, an offhand statement in support of the protest in the opposition groups in Venezuela. But if it goes wrong, if all hell breaks loose, he can turn around and say, "Look, it's another Libya." Can look at the current
Absolutely.
state of the world order. So he's pretty
Right.
much in a win-win situation. He's going to lose very little, but either way, he's going to have a talking point that works for him.
Yeah, correct. He's not going to give up everything else, at least not so far. Uh, that he's established just because he's signaled to this point. Um, it's also like if our predictions that America is negotiating some kind of retraction from the global theater, in a sense, you could say from a very Machiavellian and pragmatic point of view, control over Venezuelan oil is going to be paramount.
Yeah, I can get into that. I agree with that sentiment, but I think we're going about it wrong. But like I said, we'll discuss that later
Yeah.
in the show. But a couple
Yep.
more topics I had is the U.S. talks with the Taliban are actually going swimmingly compared to how they've gone in the past. Now, they've been going on since July of 2018, pretty much in conjunction with Trump saying, "Oh, I want to withdraw. I want to decrease our presence in Afghanistan," so on and so forth. So these talks have been taking place in Qatar, which I think is actually a bit of an odd candidate. I would have expected a. I, all I can say is I would not have expected Qatar, especially with the U.S.-Qatar relations the way they are as of recently. But the U.S. and Taliban are hammering out an agreement after months on and off talks. Now, the U.S. negotiators, what key thing they want is they want the Taliban to pledge not to allow Al Qaeda operate in Afghanistan. Now, on top of this, the Taliban is already fighting ISIS cells within the country. So it's not too far of a stretch to think that they would go after Al Qaeda. Now, some would think, Taliban, the Al Qaeda, after years of media coverage after 9/11, people thought they were pretty much the same thing, which couldn't be further from the truth. Again, of course, that goes to ignorance, that goes to malice. Discussion for a different day.
Yeah.
But the Taliban has been on and off. They've sided with ISIS when it's convenient. They've sided with the U.S. when it's convenient. Pretty much they've just shifted depending on which way the war went. And now that the U.S. Is possibly looking to leave, they say it like, "Oh, hey, if we can get rid of these guys and these guys at the same time, it doesn't sound like too bad of a deal."
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very much so. It hasn't worked. They're very persistent. I'm not going to repeat the whole graveyard of civilizations thing, but
it holds up for a reason, is all I'm going to
yeah,
say.
I don't know what to say. I mean, they're just very resilient. Of course, there are people selling them weapons. Who is it? It's probably several parties. At the end of the day, there's people willing to make a buck, and there are people, willing to, fight to the death. And that's the way it's crumpling right now. So mixed metaphor, pathetic.
Yeah, and it's actually interesting because Trump, you get him in pretty much civilian eyes, which has been a great strength and great weakness. But he can look at it from an outsider perspective, from a civilian perspective. Granted, a very rich civilian, say, "What are we doing in Afghanistan? This policy makes no sense." But again, I couldn't be happier with the direction things are going in Afghanistan, especially considering the fact there hasn't been as many attempts or stories trying to derail it as we have in Syria, which, aside from that alleged ISIS prison break thing, and aside from the two other attacks ISIS did, the media's been quiet about Syria ever since this Venezuela issue came up. So it's a bit interesting. That's all I have to say.
Yeah, I mean that's been the pattern for the war. When Western media is quiet about it, it usually means things aren't going their way.
Yeah.
So
Now, one last story I want to cover before we get into the main issue. This kind of segues into it, but as I said last week, Erdogan traveled to Moscow yesterday to meet with Putin for primarily negotiations on Syria. Now, the meeting between the two was very warm, which is actually mind-boggling to imagine just 4 years ago what it would have been. But they called each other "my dear friend" and greeted each other in very friendly ways. You know, the smiley handshakes you always see Putin do with certain leaders. Erdogan's one of them. Trump sometimes one of them. It's actually a bit weird, but that's aside the point. Now, Putin did, however, express disappointment over the Idlib agreement that they struck back in September, telling Turkey that there's still too many terrorists in the zone and they need to clean that up. But they didn't scrap the deal altogether. And Turkey, even just for the reason of appeasing Putin at the time of the meeting, said, yeah, okay, we agree with you. But again, the Idlib patchwork agreement is a patchwork agreement, and it's showing really, it's better than what could be, but it's far from ideal. Now, go on.
No. Go ahead.
Yeah, you comment on the Idlib since I was going to go into something else. So if you want to say something on Idlib, go ahead.
Yeah, I would say it's a temporary measure that could last for several more years. I think there's a strong chance that area may end up being like the Kurdish section in Iraq. It's too early to tell, but the whole point, I mean, what Syria and Russia need is relative peace in Damascus, and no more incursions over the land that they already have captured.
Which aside from some failed Israeli strikes here and there, they pretty much have.
Right. And they're a country that's been used to this for nearly 10 years now, right? At least 8 or 9. And so they're used to some areas of their country just like literally in smoke, and other areas the look of absolute normalcy. But yeah.
Just like Sweden.
Wow, I did not think it would go there. Yeah, but you go ahead. That's all I have to say about it.
Yeah, but I fundamentally agree. I think this is pretty much going to be one of those things that's the can they kick down the road until pretty much tensions die down. I mean, again, at this point, I think because it hasn't happened, I don't think there's going to be an Idlib offensive unless there's some major event that happens. But that's aside the point. I imagine we'll have more news about that in the coming weeks or months or whatever. But yeah, this meeting did coincide. In fact, it was eclipsed by the U.S. announcement to recognize opposition leader Juan Guaido as the interim president of Venezuela. Now, Putin and Erdogan are both standing by Maduro, however, and we'll get into that. But before I get into that, I do want to say something to keep in mind going into this chaos happening in Venezuela. America being a global leader, or the leader of the free world, whatever you want to call it, necessitates that in many cases, the Americans must forego what's in their own national interest to fulfill that role.
Right.
And I just want you to keep in mind going into that. So yesterday afternoon, Vice President Mike Pence declared that the U.S. now recognizes opposition leader and National Assembly President Juan Guaido as the interim president. And he also did it in very rigid, very poor Spanish. I don't even speak Spanish, but I could just tell it was poor Spanish. And he looked like he was in pain while he was doing it, if I'm being honest.
Yeah.
Now, just a week after this happened just a week after Pompeo declared the Maduro government illegitimate, which I went into last week. It's technically true concerning the fact Maduro can hardly govern the country, but it's also an unnecessary provocation that doesn't really reap much benefit to us. Now, governments that have followed the suit of the U.S. have been the European Union, who, keep in mind, their government is unelected, the U.K., who are currently dealing with the Brexit debacle, France with the Yellow Vests, Ukraine, whose government came to power in a coup, Canada, Trudeau, need I say more? Brazil actually makes sense. I could see it being flooded with Venezuelan refugees. You have enough. I say Brazil has the most just case in all of this, but that's aside the point. Paraguay, Argentina, Peru, Ecuador, Costa Rica, Chile, Guatemala, Panama, Honduras, Kosovo. That one's real scary. Georgia, Australia, Haiti, the Bahamas. Those are all the countries standing by the opposition leader, Juan Guaido. Now, governments standing by Maduro, as we said, are Russia, Turkey, China, Iran, Syria, Bolivia, Mexico, Cuba, and Uruguay. Now, most of the countries we listed on both sides, aside from a few, really are just doing it as symbolic measure to go along with whatever bloc, whatever their allies say. I mean, I don't expect, I don't know, Peru to do much against Venezuela. And I don't expect, Kosovo to do much against Maduro, nor do I expect Assad to go send some troops to Maduro in the middle of his civil wars. But yeah, again, it's mostly symbolic. Honestly, the Russians, they talk a big game, but at the end of the day, it's all about projection, power, politics. As I said before, Venezuela is not Crimea. It's not Tartus. So the Russians probably aren't going to hammer this issue as hard as they would if it was something on their own doorstep or something, for example, in their backyard, just the Middle East. So I think a lot of people on both sides, whether they be the detractors or supporters, are really playing up the Russian thing. Now, China, they have a lot of investments in the country, but they have a lot of investments anywhere. And pretty much Chinese investments have been lost in the clusterfuck of Venezuela. Pardon my French there, but I do want to continue on saying waves of protests that then hit the streets of major cities across Venezuela, asking the outside world to bail them out for their own poor choices, which that's honestly what it is. Now, the military's top brass said they're standing by Maduro. The man the U.S. recognizes as interim president, Juan Guaido, is a member of the Popular World Party, which is affiliated with the Socialist International. Now, the Venezuelan movement isn't against socialism as the people championing it would want you to believe. They're just anti-Maduro. It wouldn't surprise me if whoever comes after Maduro, whether it be Guaido, whether it be somebody we've never heard of, sells the country to the Chinese anyway, which is what we're allegedly trying to prevent.
Right, and this is also about oil, and it's about the nationalization of oil. It's also about American sanctions to stop it. It's also very much like where America is going to be in the next 50 years and what role Venezuelan oil is going to play in the future. Because the world's going to be a very different place in 50 years than it is now. It's going to be very different in 20 years. So a lot of it is just very pragmatic. Yeah, I mean, obviously it's another coup. This guy's never been elected. He's like literally like Poroshenko in that regard. He's a stooge that's gone through their education system, their intelligence system, and he's there waiting when they're going to plop him in. I don't think his situation in Venezuela is going to be any prettier than it was for Poroshenko in Ukraine.
Yeah, and like I said, this guy's basically a carbon copy of Maduro, pretty much ideologically in line with him. The people of Venezuela supported Maduro until the oil prices fell, and then they decided to blame him for stuff I'll get into. Of course, the U.S. bears a lot of blame for it, but again, the absolute ingenious of the Venezuelan people also cannot be excused from this, but I digress on that point, at least for now. Now,
yeah, I mean, it's not over. I mean, it's not over. The army has not relinquished. This is not over by a long shot. Not
absolutely
yet.
Not.
We'll see. I mean, I think in terms of like fourth generation warfare, I think Russia is probably happy that America might get itself involved in a conflict in its own backyard, kind of like a payback for Ukraine,
or even the Soviet war in Afghanistan, if we want to go back that far.
Yeah, I don't know. I just know that if like we said earlier, if Trump goes full hog on this, like he's not going to be reelected.
Yeah, and interesting you say that because I was actually just about to get into that. Now, as a response, Maduro has officially expelled U.S. diplomats and given them 72 hours to leave. Now, the U.S. said their diplomats will not leave because they do not recognize Maduro as the legitimate president of Venezuela and say he has no authority to. This has potential to be both Trump's Libya and his Benghazi. Now, at this point, again, everything's up in the air. I don't see a U.S. invasion. We'll possibly, again, do a Libya where it's a lot of air power. It's a lot of more so covert things, not necessarily an outright invasion. But again, everything's still up in the air. But we're still rocking the boat with unnecessary moves that don't really play into our hands at all. Now, that's pretty much what I'd say. Like I said, this has potential to be both Trump's Libya with the regime change and the possibility to be both Trump's Benghazi with what's happening with the diplomats.
Right, I totally agree. And you know what? I mean, the stakes are really high right now, and especially for him. Because let's say they do go in. If he withdraws from there, I mean, he will go down as a coward and a traitor. Like, the Russia narrative will never leave. So if he goes in, he's in there for good, and he better resolve it quickly. Despite the fact, however, that if he does go in, the certainty of refugees flooding into the States is a given.
Yeah, 2 million
and
new
denying them
Venezuelan
entry.
Americans in Florida and Texas turn them blue for the end of time.
Right, and denying them entry will be seen as cruel and inhumane, and rightly so. So he really has to think about this. If he's going to pull another rabbit out of a hat, I pray to God that he does. But this is like for him and for America right now, this is not a good moment.
Oh, absolutely not. And like I said, like I said, and I think if there's going to be U.S. action, it's going to be like a Libya, where it's mostly air campaign, and we have some people on the ground. But the details are all side the points. It's also still so much in the air. But again, if any military action happens and the displacement happens, you'll have the liberals here and the Rhino neocon Republicans saying we have to be compassionate. We have to help these people. We destroyed their country. We need to take them in. I'm sure they won't harbor any resentment towards us and vote against you, Mr. President. I mean, Rubio was actually at the White House on Tuesday, which it was pretty much, I think, is probably the catalyst for all this. And I joked on Twitter, it's like, so you see, Mr. President, we need to destroy what's left of Venezuela, let in millions of refugees, and then give them all voting rights.
Yeah, exactly. Like the country, the entire West is right now so polarized. Like we don't need more of this. It's not. I mean, it's not good. I mean, like even the problems that we talk about or that we hint at on Twitter, like they're going to be there like for decades. Like if everything stopped today, we'd have the same problems.
Yeah. I mean,
And
you get just as an aside, you get John Bolton there. You think the Iranian regime's over, and then you're like, you breathe a sigh of relief, and then it's like, what is happening in Venezuela right now?
yeah, honestly, it's a very poor choice. I can't believe the amount of support from the Democrats. I mean, the Never Trumpers is another issue altogether.
Yeah,
But
yeah. Bill Kristol has been fortunately quiet, but his friend Max Boot, of course, not. But and I do have to say, in terms of support for it, now there's many people who I think are intelligent, agree with on pretty much everything, whose opinions I respect greatly, who have endorsed this, not necessarily military intervention, but endorsed the U.S. recognition of Guaido as president. Now they cite the Venezuelan Constitution, and I ask them, why should a foreign document have any bearing on U.S. policy? Now, these are people who, rightly so, criticize, like when UN charters try to violate U.S. internal law or some other international organization where it tries to violate internal law, yet they want to let the Venezuelan Constitution dictate who we recognize as legitimate government there.
yeah, that's right. I mean, of course, it's part of America's mythology. It's the democratic version of the knight slaying the dragon, which is, of course, everybody knows it's a very old narrative. So the dragon is, evil, bad dictators, and so on. But not, like, I mean, let's not forget, like, all the highest positions in intelligence offices now are they're run by women, and 4 of the top 5 CEOs for the military contractors in America are also women. So, like, when we've hinted at this, I mean, we've talked about how what the new narrative for maintaining global dominance will be. And
it's going to be under feminism and support for minority groups and all this, all these liberal talking points that the conservatives will laugh at any other time, but they'll applaud when they're, at the front of the CIA.
Exactly. And this is why long term and short term, this is going to be very dangerous.
Yeah, and I do want to continue. Actually, you made a very good point that segues into this very good. Many of the people who support Trump's decision, even just to recognize, not necessarily even military intervention, they view this as an ideological crusade against socialism. While at the same time, many of them also recognize that the opposition is pretty much the same as Maduro. What I find additionally frustrating, now I went on about this on Twitter last night, is the diaspora groups and foreign dissidents who feel entitled to the support of the Western world and who believe their sob story should dictate U.S. foreign policy.
Yeah, well, I mean, the two go hand in hand, right? The more diverse your population is from, either from previous conquest or just economics, the more reason you have to push the country into another conflict zone, because it's still, at the end of the day, it's still about expansion.
Oh, of course. And, I frankly, in terms of the ideological battle against socialism, I could not care less. Although I don't want it in my country, I don't think it would work in the United States. I'm not saying it would work at all. That's a debate for a whole different day. I personally, but all that aside the point, I don't care what a foreign country does with its internal policy, as long as it is not threatening U.S. sovereignty, security, or interests, which Venezuela does not. Now, arguments against Maduro are predicated on the democratic process. And yet again, I do not care about democracy, especially in foreign countries. And this also seems very out of character for Trump. It's as if somebody else is calling the shots, which it could be. Now
it could be he's playing a gamble.
Yeah,
it could be like this is what you get if you want the wall.
Yeah, now it could be, not could be, but you have to consider about Trump. He has met and sat down with Kim Jong-un and is probably going to do so in the near future if this newest Korea summit pans out, which I have high hopes for. Now, Kim spent a year launching missiles into Japanese territory and threatening the U.S. and our allies in the region. Trump helped to defuse the crisis through negotiations and peace talks, and the two Koreas move closer and closer to unification every day. Probably one of the greatest achievements of Trump, at least so far. Only future will tell what will happen. Now, if we can sit down to somebody like that who's actually a threat to the U.S., if we can offer several times to sit down with Rouhani before it was derailed by the likes of John Bolton and Mike Pompeo, which it almost happened in September, believe me, we can sit down with someone like Maduro, who can barely even run his own country. Yeah, especially if we're willing to sit down with Kim Jong-un, who, could have been considered a threat at one point. There's no reason we can't sit down with this third world dictator who's in our own backyard and doesn't even have a missile program.
Right. It's a question of, I thought it was the art of the deal, not the art of the fold. So, I'm baffled as well, and I guess we're going to talk about the speech later on, but that's another topic that seems out of character, and that his arm's been twisted.
He's being very hamstrung on both domestic policy with the whole thing going on, Pelosi, the State of the Union, the wall. He's being completely hamstrung on that by probably his closest advisors. He's being hamstrung on his foreign policy, especially this Venezuela thing. This seems like something John Bolton cooked up with Marco Rubio and served to Trump, saying, "Oh, trust me, this will turn out great. Just leave it to us, Mr. President. You can have full faith in us. Just ignore our previous comments about you from 2-3 years ago. We take all that back, and we're your best friends now." But as for the question of whether the protests are CIA and State Department, I will say this, somewhat. Under Chavez, however you want to pronounce it, the previous leader of Venezuela, the model was to use oil revenues to fund a generous welfare state, similar to what Norway does, Saudi Arabia does, and what Gaddafi's Libya did. The difference between Venezuela and those other models is the others used oil revenues to diversify their economy. Venezuela, not so much. When the 2014 oil boom happened and tanked global oil prices, countries like Saudi Arabia felt budget strain, felt some heat, but they didn't fall apart. Now, of course, helps Saudi Arabia wasn't sanctioned by the U.S. and had the U.S.'s full support. Same with Norway. But that's Venezuela right. Did. Now, as for U.S. sanctions, I wouldn't say they were the primary cause of it, but I would say it's pretty much kicking a man while he's already down and just made it a lot worse than it needed to be.
Yeah, and also we discussed the more America chases areas of Russian interest, the more America is going to kick a beehive, and it will contradict Trump's message that he used to get elected. And I'm not even talking about bringing the troops home. I'm talking about migration and refugees.
Oh yeah,
so I mean, it's really a losing strategy.
Yeah. Now, I believe U.S. sanctions should be lifted. I believe we should normalize diplomatic relations. I grant it's too late for this at this point. We can only hope for the best. But I believe the U.S. should have lifted sanctions, washed its hands of it, stayed out of it, been an outside observer, and let the events play out as they were. Because I believe Maduro's pretty much signed his own death warrant as of 2 years ago. He, not only like we can have the debate about like, oh, socialism, or is it good or not, or does it work? But Maduro himself was just I mean, he was a former bus driver that was friendly with Chavez, who managed to weasel his way into power. So it's not like he's some political genius. Now, the protests, I believe, were genuine because the people were desperate. Now, that's also thanks in part to U.S. sanctions. But I believe the U.S. is also throwing fuel on the fire, especially with the recent moves. Now, I will say this. For those who want the U.S. to intervene or even support the opposition, I will ask you again, what benefit is it to the United States, especially considering the opposition is really no different than Maduro? And do you expect a country with a national average IQ of 83 to transform into a stable society if they just have a free and fair election? They'll just vote for what they had before. They'll just vote for another strongman, another Maduro. If we get lucky, maybe they'll vote for someone, slightly more on the right, maybe a center-right authoritarian. That's probably the best we could, hope for, at least in terms of American interest. Now, despite what both supporters and detractors say, for the average American, there will be no spoils of war. Now, of course, the military-industrial complex, the companies in bed with the government, they'll get their payday. But at the end of the day, what the American people will get and what the American government will get, they will get another parasitic, over-dependent, quote-unquote, ally.
Right, and how long will that last? I mean, the reason Venezuela became a problem was with Chavez was in the first place that it's
yeah, I know
a kind of topsy-turvy place. It's a volatile place. I almost think more could have been achieved if bribery was used instead. Like if the approach had been different. Because honestly, we don't need the repercussions of another war.
Oh, absolutely not. Or even just like another quote-unquote regime change, just another air campaign. I mean, even if we don't have boots on the ground, it's still going to be just disastrous.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree.
But I will say this, you were just slightly now referencing it. The 2002 coup attempt we had against Chavez, that pretty much destroyed any right wing there was in Venezuela. Not like there was much of it in the first place. And we pretty much signed their death warrant. So, again, this is another self-created problem. Again, like you said, we could use bribery, or we could have just actually sat down with Chavez and said, you know what? Yeah, I know you don't like us. I know we don't like you. But let's at least pursue mutual interest as business partners, not even as allies or friends.
Right. I mean, I think America has a technology. I could be wrong if somebody knows in the chat, but I know that, okay, we all understand that Venezuela has the highest oil deposits in the world, but there's problems with the oil and the amount of refinement it needs. But the truth is, America is not going to go indefinitely with, like, the shallow drilling all throughout. Like that can't go on forever. I think America has the wherewithal and the ability to, have the finest refineries to take advantage of that oil, and a deal could have been made. It's a very neglected part of the world, and primarily because America involved itself so much in the Middle East, it has gone neglected.
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, people talk about how Maduro, he's letting the cartels run through his country, blah, blah, blah. Well, I mean, okay, our so-called ally, Mexico, is letting the cartels run through their country. All these Central American countries are letting the cartels run through their country. Colombia, another so-called ally of ours, are letting the cartels run through their country. The cartels are there because these countries, they can't support themselves. You know what? I'm a critic of foreign aid. I'm a critic of intervening in other countries' businesses. But just to prop up the stability of some of these countries that have shown pretty much ever since they've gotten their independence from the Spanish that they have a hard time taking care of themselves without a strongman. I think the U.S. does have some place to do that just to stop any flows of migration. And again, it goes back to this thing, like, yeah, the cartels would be there if Maduro was a far-right monarchist reactionary who crowned himself the new emperor of Gran Colombia and invaded his neighbors trying to recreate whatever, vanity project whoever had at some point. But I think you get my point.
Yeah, I do.
Yeah, and I would appreciate it if we could just do away with the illusion of democracy. If we said, we're going to work with people who are interested. Because, Bolsonaro, a lot of people say, like, oh, he's a fascist, oh, he's a dictator. He's not. He's heavy-handed, which I don't have a problem with. and his interests are more or less in line with the United States, I would say he's probably better than anyone else we can find down there. But if we could say, like, yeah, he's a brutal guy, he's, kind of heavy-handed, but he helps the U.S. on the world stage. If we could find someone like that, and if we could dispel the illusion of democracy, I think that would go a lot further. We just came out open with our intentions. Because, I mean, it's not like the people of Latin America are going to be too torn up. It's not like they have been the biggest fans of democracy historically.
Right. I mean, I've kind of myself. I mean, I understand that your pragmatic view of the situation, and I appreciate it. And I reluctantly agree with it. I'm not very impressed with Bolsonaro. I think he hasn't turned out to be as delightful of a surprise as we had hoped. Whether we're talking about the rainforest, which is actually important. I mean, long term, and his cozying up with Israel and so on. But I would agree with you. I think America's number one purpose is to keep those countries functional, because America will pay for it if they're not.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, pretty much ever since the Spanish left, it's pretty much been a free for all. I mean, you've gotten your figures, you've gotten your Pinochet. Say what you will about him, but at least he kept the country stable. You had your what was the guy from Argentina? That Perón. He kept Argentina in line. In fact, Argentina was one of the top countries in the world under him. But that's beside the point. You had the military dictatorship in Brazil, which Bolsonaro did praise. Again, like I said, Bolsonaro has been disappointing on some fronts. I'm hoping he's like a Trump figure where, maybe his first year's rough, but then he really comes around and comes out all guns blazing. That's what I'm holding out for.
It's a good point, actually.
Yeah, and he's also somewhat of an outsider, so he probably was taking him at the same thing Trump's were, like the naivete with the establishment advisors. But like I said, generally in that region, we need to come at it. We don't need to promote democracy. We don't need to promote human rights. We need to go in. Yeah, I criticize the Chinese a lot specifically for this, but we need to go in with a similar approach to the Chinese. We're here to do business. We don't care what you think about us. We have money. You have resources. Let's make a deal, and let's forge strong ties so we keep people like the Chinese out of your country. Since a lot of these Latin American countries, they don't like us, but they don't like the Chinese either. So if we could go in without trying to preach to them or pretend like we're morally superior and said, look, we're a rich country and you have stuff we want, so let things happen as they will, and we'll leave each other's internal policy alone as much as we can, I think that would be the best alternative. Now, is that going to happen? Hopefully someday. I don't see it in the near future, especially with this ridiculous move that has been made as of yesterday.
Right. I mean, and the reason those countries, besides the lower prices, are taking Chinese money for development is China doesn't ask them, when are you going to accept tranny kids? How come your gay pride parades are so small? Did you count every single ballot in that election? Was that election 100% free and fair? Did the guy we want to win? No, China says, I don't care who wins, just do business with us. Exactly. So there's no, and of course, practically that if trade is going to increase stability, there's not much more you can ask for. The ideological ambitions of America are really just extraordinary. There's a rejection of them in their own country. And but I mean, it looks like intelligence and the military are willing to die on that hill.
And I'll also say this about, look, I can agree that Chinese influence in Latin America, in our backyard, is a major problem. But I think we would be better served by addressing the Chinese influence in our own country and in a country neighboring us, like Canada, before we try to go on the daunting task. Like I said, it's a daunting task. It needs to be done. We need to do it eventually. But I think we got to drive it out of the country on our border and our own country before we can even think about trying to drive it out of the countries south of us that don't even border us.
Yeah, that's right. Ideology is also a lot like advertising. it's literally something that America has decided, like certain corporations, that it has to be in the mind of these people continuously. Yeah, I have no answer. I mean, the only way this could work is literally if the entire world fell for Enlightenment values and neoliberalism and capitalism.
Which is not going to happen. Like you said, it's being rejected in their homelands anyway. I mean, pretty much it's been a fire sweeping across Europe, especially Eastern Europe, into Italy and the Western Europe. It's finally broken that. You see what's happening in France, even the, commie left-wing protesters. I mean, communism, say what you will about it. I know you're more on the Nazbol side, which, I don't necessarily have a problem with. It's still a rejection of Enlightenment values and neoliberalism, which again, I'll take what I can get. I don't care if France has a Nazbol president. That actually might be a bit entertaining. But again, we're also rejecting it in part in the United States with Donald Trump, or even to an extent, I know he isn't really the best, but what Bernie Sanders stands for, at least. You see it somewhat in Canada with Bernier. I'm not going to say he's some like great reactionary or somebody really strong against the neoliberal system. But again, what he represents is you're seeing rejections of it across the world because you have countries like China, which are rising, which have never embraced them. And they seem to be doing just dandy for themselves. In fact, in many ways, better than the Western world. And we look at that and we think, why do we need pride parades in the street? Why do we need to reject everything that our ancestors fought and died for and built with their bare hands and spent generations maintaining just for a group that is, 5% of the population? Or I think you get my just beyond the pride parade stuff. Pretty much like any of our modern values for the secularism, the liberalism, the do as you wish. I made this is actually my pinned tweet. Pretty much in this country, we can't stop the policy that is abortion. We can't stop that in our own country. We can't secure our own borders coming in as they please. And we cannot stop complex from attacking a bunch of 16-year-old kids for expressing the wrong opinion, but we think we can spread freedom and democracy to every corner. To that, I love this country. I love the current state it's in. It makes me sad, if you can't tell. That's honestly a big row. We're not in a position to lecture anyone about more.
Hello? I think
until we've that. Hello?
Yeah. I agree. There is this kind of pigheadedness, almost like once this is achieved. I mean, look, there's been a lot of integration with capitalism and neoliberalism. That goes way back. It goes to back to the early '70s with Reagan's victory. His victory was founded on the idea that like capitalism should focus on the individual and not an individual with a family. So you can see the exacerbation, right, of the philosophy of the individual, right? The individual precedes reality. He is anti-social, or maybe you can call it non-social, and then he is socialized. However, that he is the beginning and the end to all of this. And you can see how capitalism also has to abide by this. And what it did is it rewarded capitalism, this intense neo-individualism, in that it created so many disposable products, right? The trends and like a hyperized individuality that can only be satiated with material. And not planning for a future or a family and so on. So capitalism has been very much rewarded with neoliberalism, and I understand that, like some of the reasons, the efforts why they would push neoliberalism everywhere, because it's rewarding to their markets, to their corporations. Right, it's rewarding not having to have a populace that is investing and being frugal with money.
Yeah.
So I understand why they're doing it, but I resent it. I resent it because it ultimately creates just a more sick world. I mean, our world right
Yeah, yeah,
now,
you know,
culturally, is entirely sick. I mean, it's so different. When I was your age, this was such a different world.
yeah, and it reminds me of what Tucker said a few weeks back. You know, the market, the economy is a tool. It's not a religion. It's not something that we need to have ritual sacrifice to. It's something there to serve us. We're not there to serve it.
Correct. And he's also said that about machines. We invent machines, and machines serve us. We do not serve machines. I like how he first did it to Shapiro and then to Kirk, or whatever his name is, the forehead guy.
Yeah, the king of conservative ink. I know who you're talking about. I can't remember the name.
Yeah, and his girlfriend left him. I know she wasn't his girlfriend. I can't help it. Yeah, I mean, if you watch that video, he's like upset. He's like begging the audience not to clap. Like it was literally like damage control. It was at that moment the genie came out of the bottle.
Yeah, I mean,
At that very moment.
you know, I somewhat used to be one of these people. I never went as far as them, I can unfortunately say. But I mean, the thing is, they think like, if we put the family first, that means everyone has to have a 70% tax rate, and you have to work, 14 hours a day in the fact. No, it doesn't mean that. It doesn't mean that the government's going to strip you. You know what? Frankly, if we undid actually a lot of the capitalism, I think the tax rates would probably fall significantly. I mean, you think about it, for the majority of this country, the majority of this country's history, there wasn't even an income tax, and I long for those days. Hopefully, I mean, look, repeal the 19th, yeah, okay, but repeal the 16th. Look, there's more work we got to do. But yeah, it's interesting because we started out talking about Venezuela, and I didn't realize until now how much of a microcosm of the world order, how things are shifting, that this defunct Latin American state actually is.
Right, and it's almost kind of silly for us to like expect them to go along with this and to go along with it genuinely. Like, really, I mean, Afghanistan never took to neoliberalism. Like, you think they're going to like? I mean, things were going a certain direction, and then America intervened in Afghanistan. Russia went in, and a semblance of Westernism that existed in Kabul was literally gone, and it hasn't reappeared in 45 years, 50 years, and probably won't for as long as that.
And probably not ever. I mean, they had I said this about Russia during our neoliberal golden age stream, but they had a taste of neoliberalism, and it did not agree with them.
Right. Yeah. It doesn't. I mean, also, like, when you consider Russians and Russian thinkers, they've been around since like the late and middle 19th century, and in many ways much more so than the other Eastern European or Slavic nations. And I mean, they fumbled, but the truth is they always want to lead what kind of economics they want to base for their people, instead of necessarily the other way around.
Yeah, and I think that actually, just not to go on too much longer, since we're pushing, we're almost to an hour, but I think it's actually pretty much expressed like with the American history and Russian history. American history has been, we pretty much have this continent to ourselves after we defeat the British, and it's expansion. We can have fun. Like, we have nothing challenging us. Whereas the Russian existence since the beginning has been, we're going to get invaded by them. They're going to take us over. We're going to be a vassal of them. We're going to break free of independence. We're going to make them a vassal. We're going to invade them to create a buffer so they don't invade us. The Russian has been a fight for survival, so they've always had to be more pragmatic about that, and that's reflected in a lot of what they do culturally and even economically.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and they've had real war in their country. They've had civil war in their country. They've had multiple invasionary wars. They've had times where their capital has been occupied by various powers. And you're right, America has never. I mean, okay, so America has had a civil war, and it was a really terrible one.
It's actually the worst conflict in this country's history was our own civil war.
Yeah, but it seems like maybe it's been forgotten, or it's counterbalanced by the ease with which America expanded in the continent.
Yeah,
and the ease with which it expanded and overcame the Soviet Union.
Yeah, not to drag on, but you can make the argument that the Soviet Union was never really a superpower. I mean, you look at the probably like the layman's definition of superpowers, country that has the ability to exert influence, whether it be military, economically, or diplomatically, anywhere in the world. I wouldn't say the Soviet Union. I would say maybe at some point they met. But I would say for most of the Soviet Union's existence, they did not meet that criteria.
Right, and they were also funded by they had huge involvement with American banks as well. I mean, I've heard some people make the argument that it wasn't really a Cold War, that like Cold War 2.0 is actually more of a Cold War than it was then.
Oh yeah, I would absolutely agree. You just had pretty much a country that had a healthy containment zone and was able to keep out foreign influence till, I mean, yeah, considering the fact that Russia, ironically enough, is actually more powerful than it was as the Soviet Union, primarily because America overextended. But it's it's fascinating how
It also shaved off a lot of territory that it needed that compromised it.
Yeah.
Right. Russians went from being 52% of the population in the Soviet Union. They're now at 81. If you count, Ukrainians, that's another 3.9. This other Slavic groups are about 1%. Well, these are very similar people with mutually intelligible languages. Now you're up at 85%. Right. Like people will talk about diversity in Russia, but actually it's not at the level in America or Western Europe. It's less than that.
In Russia, it's a lot more contained. For example, there's a lot of Chechens, but they all live in Chechnya. How many Chechens do you see in Moscow or St. Petersburg?
Right. They exist. I mean, I've seen them, right? Yes.
Yeah, but there's not Chechen neighborhoods or ghettos there.
Right. So also if they raise a fuss, if they start to undermine Russia, Russia will not hesitate to bring the war to them, even though it's in their territory, right? Whereas in the West, we do the opposite, right? We make sure that there's a mix everywhere, despite the city.
Yeah, I mean, any major town you go into has a Chinatown, has look, we have the Little Mexico or whatever.
Right. So they can play with the idea of waxing and waning. Their area can wax and wane, but there's a core that remains theirs. So that's a strategy. That's their strategy.
Well, with that, I think we've had quite the show. But I will say this in closing. Again, I ask anyone who wants the U.S. to recognize Guaido as the president, not for any moral reasons, not for any ideological reasons, but for pragmatic reasons. How does it benefit the United States of America? That is the question I leave you with tonight. Thank you all for tuning in for episode 40. We've made it this far. It's been almost a year since this project started, but thank you all for tuning in. We will see you next time, and goodbye.